Welcome to another episode. Today, I'm thrilled to be having a conversation with Tom Cronin. Tom is a renowned speaker and corporate meditation and mindfulness trainer, recognized internationally for his classes and programs as a leadership expert. He is known for his inspiring and humorous presentations on leadership, stress management, mindfulness, and empowerment. Tom has held classes and programs with hundreds of companies, conferences, and media outlets as a speaker and mindfulness trainer from Amazon, Coca Cola, UBS, Bank of China, and more. Also known as the King of Calm. Welcome, Tom.
It's great to be here. Looking forward to connecting with you today in the audience.
Excellent. So, Tom, you've spent 26 years as a broker trading swaps and bonds on international finance markets, and also spent 25 years studying Eastern philosophy, spirituality, meditation, and mindfulness. Presently, you blend these two worlds with your inspirational and moving presentations. Intriguingly, you left the world of finance to become a meditation teacher, transformative coach, and retreat host. So, Tom, can you please share with our listeners your personal journey, your inspiration, and what ultimately led you down this career path?
Yeah, I started my career as a broker the same year that Jordan Belfort, the Wolf of Wall Street, started his career, which was 1987. And interestingly, that year was a phenomenal year because it was also the year that we had Wall Street, the film, came out with Bud Fox and Gordon Gekko. And it was also the year that Bonfire of the Vanities came out, which had the Master of the Universe as the central character in that, who was a bond broker as well. And, it was kind of crazy times in the industry, and I kind of got swept into that industry. Before I knew it, I was doing lots of drugs, drinking, partying, and making tons of money. And it's really interesting when we have those things in front of us, it kind of throws you from your North Star. And that's really what happened to me. I was just really lured in to the glamour and the glitz of that world. And it was very enticing and inspiring for me. And I was only 19 years old. And the thing is, when you go down that path, you get indications from your body and from the universe that maybe there's a better alternative, but that's signals that we get. And I was getting a lot of signals at that time through those first few years of anxiety, depression, insomnia, panic attacks. And I just kept ignoring those signals, like red lights on a dashboard, which I see as symptoms. Symptoms in the body is like a red light on the dashboard of your vehicle. And because I was ignoring them and continued on having really, really late nights, big benders till 3, 4, 5 in the morning, working all day on a trading room floor, lots of drugs, drinking, partying, the body doesn't give up on you. It continues to exacerbate and accelerate those symptoms in bigger and bigger ways. And so it just started to blow up eventually. Having ignored those symptoms for so long, I reached a critical breaking point, which was in my late 20s after 9 years, 10 years in that industry, living that lifestyle. My system simply collapsed down and it was diagnosed as a nervous breakdown. And at that point, I was seeing psychiatrists, psychologists, put on medication, and really unable to go to work, had to take mental health leave from work. And things were pretty dire at that point. I was really questioning whether I even wanted to live life. I was so far from who I really thought I could be and should be in my life. And at that point, interestingly, I discovered meditation by watching a documentary about a property developer who was using it as one of his tools for success. And when I came across that, this idea that this successful business person would use meditation, this was in the 90s, so that we didn't have meditation apps and meditation wasn't a big thing back then. It was a big game changer for me. It was like a light bulb moment, and that's when I started to explore meditation and Eastern philosophy. And it was a game changer for me. It really was something that turned my life around very quickly. All those anxieties, addictions, anomalies started to melt away. I certainly didn't become a perfect monk straight away, but I definitely noticed some changes happening quite quickly. And interestingly, I went back into that job for 16 more years, but just without all the partying and the drinking and the drugs, and sustained a very successful career over the long run, over 26 years all up. But in that time, over those 16 years, I went deep down the rabbit hole of Eastern philosophy and meditation and mindfulness and understanding the body and the correlation between body and mind and stress. And eventually I found so much information in that research that I just got so compelled that I needed to share this with the world. And that's when I transitioned out of corporate into becoming a teacher and doing what I'm doing today.
How You mentioned when you first started in the finance industry, you became exposed to, drugs, partying, etc. And then you kind of you had this nervous breakdown, you took a break. And with the advent of meditation, things were quite different. How did it differ when you re-entered the world of finance, knowing the benefits and having the daily practice of meditation?
It was quite a challenging transition, and this is where I think we're at within the world right now. When you are living a very different paradigm to the rest of the status quo, you become an anomaly. You become the odd one out, and that's really uncomfortable for most people, as it was for me. There's a lot of criticism, ridicule, or just points of difference, and it makes things very difficult for you. You generally want to do what the norm is doing, what the masses are doing, which is why we generally subscribe to mediocrity, because it's just what the masses are doing. And so it was a little bit challenging, but I knew definitively that this was the path that I wanted to take and how I wanted to live my life. And so eventually that point of difference became a point of respect and acknowledgement within the industry. But it was challenging because industry, particularly the interaction in that industry, a lot of it was based on drinking and drugs. Nearly every function certainly had alcohol in it. And behind the scenes, a lot of those functions had drugs as well. And it was very hard to participate in those interactions, whether it was an end of day work drinks, or whether it was a big meeting with a large investment bank, or whether it was an end of year function. It was very difficult to find a path that was true for you and not part of what the collective, what the masses wanted you to do. But eventually I just stood firm and did what I wanted to do. And that was accepted over time. Generally it was appreciated. And what happens when we stay true to that in doing the things that are true for you to live a healthy, happier life, it gives other people opportunity to be inspired as well. If everyone's just doing the same thing, then there's no one to offer any level of new inspiration or possibility or alternative, because you just don't know that there's one that exists. And so by standing true and then representing a new alternative, it gave other people who were interested another roadmap or another guide to maybe find another path for them as well that might have been going through the difficult times that I was going through.
When you re-entered finance, and again, having this practice of meditation in your daily life, did anybody ask you about it? Did anybody ask you what you did differently? Were you a mentor to anybody at that point in time?
There's an interesting phenomenon. It sounds a bit posy, I guess, in our Australian language, but there's a saying, at first they ridicule, then they revere. And what that means is that point of difference becomes a point of ridicule. And that's generally what Talkback Radio is, and editorial columns, and we're usually finding some point of difference in our world and ridiculing that. And we look at some of the great leaders in our times, like the Christs and the Gandhis and the Mandelas, they were ridiculed because of their point of difference. But eventually what happens, if you look at the Gandhis, Mandelas, and Christ now, there's a lot of reverence for what they contributed to the world. And on a much smaller scale, certainly by no means comparing myself to those people at all, but at a microcosm of that, the people that were ridiculing eventually over time were the ones that would send you a little email quietly saying, hey, listen, I'm going through a really difficult time in my marriage. Can we catch up for lunch and go for a coffee? You're the only person I feel that I can talk to in here that might be able to, provide me some sense and sensibility through this difficult time. So some of them became students of mine over the long run. Some of them wanted just me to do some gentle mentoring, but definitely for a small few, there was some people that were open to the idea that I could support them in some way. But yeah, I was quite open about it, only because at times I would have to go to work functions, and transitioning from the end of day to the work function, I usually wanted to fit in my evening meditation, and I would have to let people know that I was going to be a little bit late. And in the end, eventually I hit it at first, but eventually I just became open about it and said, I'm just going to duck in and do my afternoon meditation, and I'll join you all a little bit later. And it was just accepted that was part of my life. Mm-hmm. It's good for us to start normalizing this. It's not normal or familiar yet. It's becoming more normal and more familiar. I'm working with some of the biggest companies in the world now. And the more people make the unfamiliar familiar, the more it's going to become familiar, the more we normalize that. So instead of going to a pub and drinking 6 beers after work because you had a tough day, to normalize the idea that you sit in a quiet room somewhere and meditate for 20 minutes as a much more powerful and positive effect on your life and other people's lives around you. Certainly if you get home at midnight completely wasted and you didn't get to see your wife and kids, then these things can change the world slowly over time as we incrementally increase the number of people doing it.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. On your website, you mentioned, I don't know how recent this was, but Forbes magazine recently published a study about the corporate sector by KPMG revealing 94% of the workplace experience high levels of stress. Now, we know that stress can exacerbate many existing conditions, such as autoimmune conditions, mental health disturbances, and gastrointestinal disturbances as well. Furthermore, chronic stress leads to increased cortisol, which then leads to inflammation and a weakened immune system, again, predisposing us to a multitude of a variety of illnesses. So more often than not, people go to their doctors, they have a conversation, the doctor says reduce stress. The question is how? Well, there are, of course, many tools, and meditation is one powerful one, a tool that I often educate my personal patients with. So when I speak to meditation with my patients, some of the common responses are, I've tried it and it doesn't work. It's not for me. I can't focus more than 2 minutes. Needless to say, it is a powerful tool with a plethora of research backing its efficacy. So my question for you, Tom, is what would some of your counter responses be to people who are reluctant to try it or have tried it and said, it's not for me?
Yeah, it's such valuable things that you're saying there about stress. And in fact, predominantly from what I've found, most doctors wouldn't actually say reduce stress. They'd simply give you a tablet to alleviate the symptom and not even address the underlying cause of the symptom, which is stress. And it takes me back to Dr. Bruce Lipton from Stanford University Medical School that says that 95% of all sickness is a result of stress. And you outlined a few of those sicknesses, which was simply a correlation to a side effect of the stress response in the body. And I call it a stress response, or the sympathetic nervous system being activated. And meditation for me was a game changer because it took me out of the sympathetic into the parasympathetic nervous system. And the problem with treatments in our world today, if we're trying to treat a person physiologically and improve their diseases whilst they're sustaining the sympathetic nervous system state, which where most people of the world are in right now without realizing it, then, and let's just use the word stress response state, the sympathetic nervous system, S for sympathetic and S for stress, then we're going to have the underlying causes of those symptoms continuing to exacerbate. And though you may be on lots of medications, and I remember my uncle coming over from America and he was on 30 medications a day because he had so many anomalies in his body. And if we can get to the underlying cause of that body being in a hyperinflamed, hyperstimulated state, then get that body out of that hyperstimulated, hyperinflamed state, put it into a peace response, which is the parasympathetic nervous system. Now we can really start to activate the body's natural healing response, but also a lot of those symptoms will go away without you having even to treat them because the body knows how to optimize and it knows how to heal. We just need to create the environment for that. So coming back to your question then, how do we respond to people who say, I tried to meditate, I couldn't do it, or there's no way I could meditate? And I was one of those people as well. So I have to be putting my hand up in that club. And one thing I learned is that we can't put meditation into one box and say, if you've tried that meditation, then you've tried them all, because there are so many different types of meditation. And if you're going to just try and sit there and close your eyes and empty your mind, forget it. It's not going to work. The mind does not want to be empty, particularly in our world today when we've got TikTok and Instagram and emails and Netflix to keep it very entertained. It just does not want to be processing information and data. So we need mechanisms or devices to help us get into those deeper, quieter states. Now, for me personally, and this is purely subjective, I found the mantra-based transcending styles of meditation, that's Vedic meditation, transcendental meditation, or primordial sound technique, where you have a vehicle called a mantra or a primordial vibration, and the repetition of that sound does all the work for you in the meditation. You don't have to try to still your mind. You don't have to try to focus on something. You simply get to effortlessly repeat that sound, and that sound has a quality in it to take the mind inward from the outside world of relativity, the world that it's activated by, and it takes the mind inward to the subtle world of the silent and stillness. So most of my students will get into a deep state of transcendence, that's to go beyond the thinking mind, usually in their first course of meditation. And that's simply because the efficacy of the practice itself. And that's why I gravitated towards that practice for 26 years and teach that practice as well. So I would suggest to students or people out there that might have some dis-ease or discomfort to look around, to shop around, find a technique that works for you, and find a teacher that you resonate with. Some people want to learn with me. Some people want to learn with a woman. Some want to learn with an old person. Some want to learn with a young person. You're going to find that definitely going to a teacher that's qualified, that can support you ongoing in your transformation, because it's not a one-stop wonder. It is a process that you go on an ongoing journey, and I'm still on that journey myself after 28 years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm going to put a pin in that idea because I'm going to ask some more questions later on in the episode. But perhaps you can share some benefits of meditation, both in the short term and long term.
The first thing, again, going back to the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system, I always like to start with that two binary sort of responses in the body. If we're in the sympathetic nervous system, we're producing high levels of cortisol, adrenaline, or epinephrine, and we're reducing, if not completely removing, the biochemicals of serotonin, oxytocin, and melatonin. We can't produce really those two simultaneously, cortisol and serotonin, which means that you're going to be in high level of stress response and feeling really happy and joyful at the same time. The body's having one or the other. Oxytocin, obviously the biochemical for love, it's the one that we need for successful relationships. It's the one that we need to feel a sense of connection and empathy and kindness towards others. Serotonin we need for for happiness. Melatonin, we need it for good sleep. And in the sympathetic nervous system, the body's protecting you in a dangerous situation, and it won't let you have those three biochemicals. So it shuts them down. And what that does is the implications of that are substantial. Having high levels of cortisol, as you said, creates so many anomalies in your body, from gut disease to impairment of your brain functionality to the high blood pressure, cholesterol. There's so many different anomalies that come out of this. What I found for me personally, the biggest shifts that I found was the anxiety dropping away because I had less cortisol. I had more serotonin, oxytocin, melatonin. The depression starting to lift. Again, more serotonin, oxytocin, less cortisol. I found the insomnia dropping away. Finally, after 10 years of chronic insomnia, I could start sleeping again because I had less cortisol, more melatonin. These are the things that eventually spilled over into other areas of my life where my physical energy levels started to pick up, my digestion started to improve, libido started to correct itself, all sorts of things. Immune system started to improve itself because it had the tools, nutrition, the values that it needed to optimize itself.
Mm-hmm. So we have these two concepts. There's, meditation, and then there's mindfulness. And often these terms are used interchangeably, right? But we have to figure out, or perhaps discuss what they mean. So moreover, the practice of meditation can be overwhelming for people who don't know exactly what it is, what to do with it, how to do it, how long to do it for. And they often think, how long do I need to do this for me to get some benefits? So first and foremost, can you define meditation and mindfulness for our viewers?
It's a great question. And they do very much get chucked in the same basket, and they're very different in my mind. Again, this is subjective viewpoint. So anyone that's an expert in mindfulness out there or meditation might have a different viewpoint to me, and I welcome that and totally open and respect their viewpoints as well. The way I see it is meditation is what I do with my eyes closed. And it's a compartmentalized window of time where I'm withdrawing from my world of senses, that's engaging in the outside world. It's the time when I'm quietening my mind and I'm going into mental, physical, and emotional stillness, a deep state of repose and rest that is considered in transcendence. When the mind is awake yet not thinking, we go into a state of metabolic rest considered up to 4 times deeper than when we're in a deep sleep. So it's a very nourishing, healing, expansive state to be in. And that's something that we want to compartmentalize time. You can't do that while you're driving. You can't do that while you're in a yoga class. You can't do that when you're eating dinner. You can't do that while you're walking. So I compartmentalize meditation as an experience that I allocate a window of time for on a regular basis twice a day. Now, mindfulness is what I do outside of meditation, and meditation helps me be more mindful. So mindfulness is, we call it in Sanskrit, sakshi kutashta, which means the silent witness. So now I have conscious awareness itself that is observing my thoughts, my mind, my actions, and my emotional state as well. So now I have my physical, mental, and emotional state and conscious awareness watching the things that I'm doing as this sort of independent witness. And that allows me to be more proactive while I'm eating my food. It allows me to be more proactive and aware while I'm driving my car. It allows me more proactivity whilst I'm watching a football game, if I was to do that. So it just allows us to have a little bit more sovereignty whilst we're outside of meditation. Meditation is something that helps me be more mindful, and mindfulness helps me with my meditation as well.
What does a mindfulness look like in the absence of meditation?
If someone's not meditating and they just want to
Exactly.
become more mindful, yeah. Look, it's again something that can be done without meditation. It's just being very aware in each moment of what you're doing and how you're doing it. And it's almost like having this degree of deep awareness, but also creating a little bit of space between you react, between a situation that arises and you, the subject that's aware of that situation, and your response to that situation. So if someone pulls in front of your car quite abruptly, you have this moment in time to choose your response to that situation. Do I stick my finger up at them and scream and shout and go and try and pull up to them and start yelling at them and throw some coins at their window? Or do I just simply think, wow, that person must be having a really difficult day and they must be in a hurry to get somewhere. I hope they're okay. And when we're mindful, what you're doing there is you're taking authority and autonomy in your life and choosing the state that your body's in, regardless of the circumstances and situations. And that's when we actually get more sovereign with our health as well. It can be something like, I'm really, really craving a big sugar hit and I'm really feeling drawn to go to Ben & Jerry's and get a massive bowl of ice cream. But I wonder if that's the best thing for me. Maybe my body's depleted of energy, and maybe if I had a handful of cashews, maybe that would be something more that my body's actually craving, and those good fats that my body's going to get as a result of that might be a whole lot better than the tub of ice cream that's going to give me a crazy sugar hit. So again, having sovereignty and selectivity when it comes to our actions and choices and words.
Mm-hmm. Now, I'm going to pose a question to you that I often get from some of my patients, because I would love to hear your thoughts. So a lot of the times, perhaps when they've been educated on meditation or we've had a conversation about it, its effectiveness, its impact, the different kinds, they can perhaps come back 2 months later in a follow-up visit and say, I've been meditating for 2 months and I feel the same way. So when can someone expect to notice a difference in their life?
It's a really good question. It's a variable. There's not a definitive, clear answer because everyone's starting point is very different. There's a variable here in the state that they're in when they start and also the technique that they're using. Those are the two variables, and the consistency with their practice. For me, I was coming from a very deteriorated state. So it was very obvious and tangible, the effect that I was having very quickly from the meditation, and also because I was using a meditation technique that was very deep and impacting. There's a very prevalent and recognizable effect that was having on my nervous system, on my mind, and on my body. So I noticed significant changes in the first 2 weeks. And that's what I tend to find with most of my students. However, if you've got someone that's starting to meditate and they're in a pretty good state already, and if they're not using a deeper meditation, those two variables, they're coming from a pretty good state, they're feeling pretty healthy and light and happy, life is pretty good, and they're using let's call it a simple guided meditation that doesn't take them very deep, they're probably not going to notice significant shifts in their life because of the state that they're already in when they started was pretty good, and there was no sort of comparison capabilities from where they were and where they got to, or very minimal. And secondly, the meditation might not be a meditation technique that was going to bring about the most significant change that they could have brought about if they use a different style of meditation.
Can you?
Like if you're using Matthew McConaughey's bedtime stories on the Calm app, then you might start sleeping a little bit better, but you might not notice profound, significant shifts throughout your day, maybe.
Can you provide one example of a very simple meditative practice and then contrast that to a very deep meditative practice?
Yeah, you asked some good questions. So a simple meditation, let's just call it a light one, would be, when I say light, it's just not going deep. It's a shallow one. And that would be something like listening to a guided meditation on YouTube that is guiding you through, let's just say, walking through a meadow. And you're listening to that person, and there's going to be a sense of shifting your awareness from, let's just say you were worrying about something and you had some boyfriend, girlfriend troubles or some financial challenges, and you think, I really need to get some meditation happening. And you turn on a YouTube video and there's a voice that's, taking you along a riverbed. And I find it a little bit hard doing those guided meditations simply because my imagination, it doesn't seem to want to follow those things. It generally wants to go, I like the deeper ones. But some people can go quite well with those guided meditations. Some people struggle with them. And so not everyone's the same. But if you're doing that and just going along this nice riverbed, and sometimes your mind will drift away, and then I've got to go back to the riverbed, and you're walking along the edge of the river or walking through a meadow, it's going to be a little bit calming, but not really going into a profoundly deep state. And that's simply because you're engaging with the voice, and you're engaging with the mind, and you're engaging with the thoughts. I've got to get back to that riverbed or that meadow that I'm walking through. Whereas if you go into those deeper states, when we transcend, that means we have now gone deeper than the thinking mind. So now we've gone into a state we call turiya in Sanskrit, Turiya. Turiya means the fourth state. So that's no longer thinking, no longer in deep sleep, no longer in dream state, which is where most people occupy their mind throughout the day, those three states. Now the fourth state is that I'm awake and not thinking. So thinking state is I'm awake and I'm thinking. Deep sleep is I'm asleep and I'm not thinking. Dream state is I'm asleep and I'm thinking. And then Turiya is I'm awake and I'm not thinking. So it's a very new phenomenon for someone to be in that state. The guided meditation along the meadow is I'm awake and I'm thinking. So it's still thinking state. It's just that they're different thoughts than the thoughts you had before. To transcend means to get into samadhi. Samadhi, sama means same in English, and dhi means intellect. So I'm in the same intellect. My intellect's not changing. So no longer in the fluctuations and constant variability of the mind thinking. I'm now into a place of consciousness and not thinking. And most students of mine will get into that state of transcendence to some degree through their first weekend course of meditation. And what it feels like sleep, but you kind of know that you're not sleeping. And it's a weird feeling because you're in a very deep state of restfulness. Sometimes you get a sort of head nodding down and you feel this. People will say to me when they come out of it, I don't know where I just went then, but wherever it was amazing and it felt incredible. And why it feels incredible is it's highly blissful. So we do get an increase in serotonin and oxytocin, which are the bliss chemicals. And having this trickle of serotonin and oxytocin into that state, sometimes an increase in melatonin as well. So some people might fall asleep or get into a drowsy state. And we see a reduction very quickly in cortisol and adrenaline. And so we're getting into this profoundly deep, nourishing state of no thought, yet consciously being awake. And it's quite profound.
Is that something that perhaps people can locate on YouTube?
Usually what would happen in the way it's taught in this tradition is that a person will learn from a teacher in person. They will get a particular sound based upon when they were born. And that sound will be a relevant mantra for them that would be most effective for their meditation. Possibly there might be some practices on YouTube. I haven't found any yet, but there may be some techniques. And again, the space is already there of conscious awareness without thoughts. We all have access to that. It's like if there's just clouds in the sky, that doesn't mean there's not blue sky. There is still blue sky. It's just that there's clouds filling up the blue sky, but the blue sky is behind the clouds. So having lots of thoughts, whether you're in meditation or not, doesn't mean Turiya or Samadhi is not there. It is still there. It's just that the pathway to getting to that can be different for different people. And there are many pathways to Turiya or transcendence. for me, the one I found most effective was Vedic meditation or transcendental meditation. However, I believe there are other techniques. It could be breath work. It could be plant medicine. I'm sure there are other methodologies, and I don't want to exclude any of those. I want to acknowledge all pathways and all traditions. It's just that I found this one was the most effective for me. That's all.
I just want to change lanes a little bit here. You have an Instagram post that I've found. I mean, you have several that resonate quite deeply and that are very interesting and intriguing and educational and informative. But this one in particular, it's about manifestation. And it says the challenge with manifesting what you want is that you need to feel as if you already have it, which then means you don't want it anymore. And interestingly, that's when you attract it. So I want to kind of parse this idea. There are numerous books, resources, guidance on, manifestation. So I ask you, Tom, you mean to tell me that I attract things by not wanting them? What exactly do you mean by this?
It's more you attract things not by not wanting them, you attract things by being in the frequency of the thing that you're looking to attract, as if you already have it. And it's not this definitive black and white thing that as soon as you feel like, just say you want to attract a partner and you really want to attract a partner and you've been looking, and you're just like, you're coming from a place of lack. I want to fill that hole because if I have that partner, then the hole that I have has been filled. But then because I'm resonating with the frequency of lack, I keep repelling the thing that I'm trying to attract. Because the thing that I'm trying to attract is actually the thing that I need to feel the resonance of what it's like to already have it. So it's a strange phenomenon. And just because you start to feel immediately what it's like to have a partner doesn't mean tomorrow there's going to be one that comes into your life. It is a process, and the manifesting world can be quite slow to catch up sometimes, and we need to sustain these vibrations for quite some time. But we are starting to find through our research, and this is very early days, it's started initially around Think and Grow Rich with Napoleon Hill in the 20s. And we're just starting to see, The Secret kind of put it on steroids a little bit in the early 2000s. Now we've got Joe Dispenza doing phenomenal work about manifesting, and we're seeing a lot of other people like Esther Hicks and other people really starting to accelerate this idea that, hang on, there is a quantum field of intelligence, and there is a field that is kind of organizing or organizational. It has that capacity to be organized. And we tend to have a lot of chaos in that field that has the capacity to be organized because we're quite chaotic inside of ourselves and quite empty inside of ourselves. And that's really a starting point for most of us. That's why we have to do this work. In generations to come, that might be different. But for now, we're coming from a deep generational code of really coming from predominantly lack. Most of our ancestors were very much, unless they were from aristocratic environments, generally had a state of lack, and we kind of inherited that code. So that's why at the moment we're trying to do a lot of this work about trying to change that code that I'm in lack, I'm always in need, I never have enough, and no matter what, no matter how rich I am, I still feel like I could always have more. And so we really want to shift that paradigm into, wow, I'm abundant, I'm affluent, I'm full of overflow of love. And when we start to have that resonance and that vibration, interestingly, of course, we no longer have the need or the want, yet we still start attracting these things into our field. It's like, wow, our relationships just seem to be very abundant because I'm feeling lots of inner love. I'm feeling that affluence starts to flow my way because I'm starting to have an overflow within me of excess energy and feeling abundant and grateful for the life that I have. And it's a work in progress for most of us, myself included, particularly coming from Irish Catholic heritage. It's deep in my lineage, and it's been a generational struggle for the family lineage. So it's about really overcoming a lot of that code that's inside of us.
You mentioned a couple of terms that I think are important to kind of just, I guess, define and pick apart. That is this idea of vibration and frequency, and we hear these terms, and for a lot of people, they are unaware of what they mean when you say frequency and vibration. What does that mean in the world of the universe and manifestation?
Yeah, to simplify, because it does sound a little bit esoteric and woo, I guess. What we're talking about is your feeling. The feeling in your body has a resonance, or otherwise known as a hertz, Hertz, and that's a measurable frequency. And if you look at the frequency chart, the human frequency chart, you can just Google that. You'll see that there's measurable frequencies from the highest ones being love, peace, and enlightenment of 500, 600, and 700 hertz. And then the lowest ones, which are shame, guilt, anger, hatred, they're around 20, 30, 40, 50. And so these are the feelings and vibrations that your body is in at any given time throughout the day. It's always in a particular frequency of some sort. And we are learning now that we can be a little bit more sovereign about the frequency that we're in using different tools and techniques. Traditionally in the past, and still for most people, their frequency is determined by circumstances in life. So if they were abused or someone yelled at them or something happened, they lost their job, then that would then affect their state, and their state would be eroded because of external circumstances and forces. And there's a lack of sovereignty in that. And we're only just learning now as a collective species that with certain tools and practices, we can reclaim a little bit more sovereignty and maintain higher frequencies regardless of the circumstances. It's hard, but with greater and greater skill sets and greater awareness and greater discipline towards that attainment. And I call it the 10,000 hour principle, which Malcolm Gladwell coined in his book, The Outliers, recognizing that people that spent large amounts of time doing one or two different things, they became very good at it. And we've become very good at shopping and drinking and gambling and scrolling and emails. But you look at the enlightened people, they became very good at that because they allocated more time to it. That's all.
You mentioned there was very high frequencies of, I think it was love, and not entitlement, enlightenment, and there was another
Peace.
what other piece, and then and a very low frequency, there's sadness, I guess, anger and frustration, or something along
Shame
those
is
lines.
actually shame and guilt is the lowest.
Oh, shame and guilt. Okay. So now what happens when there's a person with a very high frequency interacting with someone at a very low frequency? What does that energy look like?
Uncomfortable. Usually it's uncomfortable for both people if they have that ability to be affected. So it can be completely unmoved for someone who's potentially in an enlightened or peaceful, loving state, who have become sovereign in their state. So if you look at someone like Mother Teresa, who had this unconditional lovingness, or many great saints and sages of our times, who, regardless of circumstances, Christ is a classic example. When he's got a crown of thorns on his head, they're put nails in his hands and feet, and he says, "Forgive them, Father. They don't know what they do." And he's still coming from that place of love, and which, of course, is why he's highly revered. And I think for someone who has learned sovereignty, being around people in lower frequencies, it helps elevate the people in the lower frequencies. However, quite often what you'll find is people in lower frequencies want other people in high frequencies to be in their particular state, because then they've got unity and connectivity. Everyone's looking for unity and connectivity in their relationships. It's why we have conflict. I don't like what you're doing. I want you to be doing what I'm doing. I want you to have my religion. I want you to have my state of being. I want you to have my experience of suffering, or I want you to have my experience of joy. And so there's always that sort of push and pull that's happening as dynamics in all relationships, whether they're global, national, or individual and personal. And so the more we can get a more unified and harmonized experience in higher frequencies, the less conflict and turmoil eventually we're going to have in the world.
Mm-hmm. I want to talk a little bit about an idea or a concept called stillness, which I know you mentioned earlier on in the episode. So I suppose the basic fundamental goal of meditation is to reach this state of enlightenment, right? Where the conscious mind is liberated from the continuous flow of mental chatter and internal unrest. Typically in our society, especially in the Western world, we have no control over these random thoughts, but with meditation, we can find inner peace of stillness and transform these thoughts from confusion and restlessness to harmonious and focused. So firstly, what is stillness?
The word samadhi comes to mind. So same, intellect, samadhi, D-H-I, like I said, is intellect. And so when we have an intellect that is conscious, awake, and not moving, And the reason why the mind won't be moving is because it's found the sweetest nectar of all. We call it bliss consciousness. There's a satiation in the mind because it's found what it's looking for. The mind is only busy because it hasn't found what it's looking for, which is fulfillment. It's constantly looking for things with an insatiable appetite. And it gets bored very quickly, looking for more charm or pleasure. So the iPhone and Samsung were the greatest invention for the mind because it now has an insatiable appetite to devour that content. And we unsovereignly, willingly just give the mind that all the time. So when we get into greater levels of inner peace, which means inner fulfillment, greater levels of inner bliss, then we start to find that the mind becomes sustainably stiller in meditation and outside of meditation. And we find that there is, as you said, a greater sense of peace within the body because there is greater levels of de-excitation. And this comes back to the law of thermodynamics that recognizes as de-excitation occurs, order increases. And as excitation occurs, disorder increases. And that comes back to thermodynamics and boiling water and things like that. So the more excitation in a system, the more chaotic it becomes. So you can have traffic driving too fast, or a football stadium of 80,000 people that start running crazy because there's a gun blast or a fire or something. We get greater excitation, greater disorder, and that's what's happening in our mind and body. So when we have de-excitation, we have greater order and cohesiveness. So stillness leads to many things. It's not a place of nothing happening. It's a place of great healing, and it's a place of great levels of fulfillment. So peace isn't something that our Western world, I shouldn't say Western world, it's the whole world now. Peace isn't something that our capitalistic commercial society conditions ourselves to subscribe to. It's not something that works well in an environment where we have to commoditize and extract out of an environment on an economic model, because if the world's peaceful, we tend to find people stop spending as much. So we really want to have more peaceful people on the planet. And I think that will solve many of the problems on the planet. Physiologically, health-wise, environmentally, all sorts of things.
What is, again, you mentioned this earlier on, what exactly is enlightenment and transcendence, and how are these two terms related?
Transcendence is something that happens in meditation. So we transcend the duality of the subject and object phenomenon. So the phenomenon of I'm the subject and I have an interactiveness or a relationship with the world outside of me, and that's the objects. Now the objects are forms and phenomenon in the future, past, or present. And me, the subject, that's the ego, interacts with those things in a dualistic nature where that thing will trigger a feeling and reaction in this thing. And again, this thing, the subject, can be interacting with a form of phenomena in the future. So I'm worried about my finances. Or it could be interacting with something in the past. I wish I didn't say that thing. I wish I didn't do that thing. And then that relationship is creating a dynamic reaction in my body and in my mind and in my nervous system. And that's happening all day long. It's even happening in our dream states. You can wake up from a dream state and be absolutely exhausted because you've been in a lot of activity on an emotional and physiological level and mental level. So when we transcend beyond duality, where there's no longer an interaction with the world outside of us. There's no longer an awareness about the world outside of us. And we're in a state of deep awareness without there being two things. There's only one thing, which is there's just conscious awareness. And that is a very profound state for all of us to get into. And I think it's a critical state for humans to start experiencing, because now we're starting to experience what it is to be being and not doing. And that liberates us from the constraints of the personality and the challenges of being the ego, the identity. Now, enlightenment is the sustainability of that. So enlightenment is something where that has been such an ongoing, consistent experience that's becoming stabilized. And so while you're in meditation and when you're outside of meditation, you're operating from that place of deep quiet and deep awareness. And not only are you less dualistic and being buffered by the world's circumstances, you're also accessing a field of knowledge and wisdom that isn't inside the cranium in the brain. You're actually accessing a field of wisdom that is kind of like, the analogy I like to use is, we have the inner mind, which is what's inside my head. And then we have the outer field of mind, which is all the information around me. And I'm not talking about information on how to code AI. It's information which is knowledge. And I'm in the soup of knowledge. I'm in the vast universal field of intelligence. And when we get into enlightenment, we start to tap into that information, that we're kind of in the mind rather than the mind's in us. It's a bit esoteric, I know, but it's something that becomes quite experiential over time.
Tom, I want to bring back our conversation now full circle and talk a little bit about meditation for beginners, because I'm sure there are many people who are intrigued but still rather skeptical. So they've never tried it, they're intrigued. What are perhaps some specific meditation practices that you would recommend for beginners, and how can one progress in their meditation journey?
A lot of people assume that, why don't you start off with like the 3-minute meditation, just focusing on your breath? Because it's short, it's easy, and it won't be hard for you to at least try that. Here's the challenge with doing something like that, is that if you don't find that A, it's enjoyable, B, you get any significant effect out of it, there's a high probability you won't keep doing it. We generally don't tend to do things that we don't enjoy doing in our world anymore. And we generally don't do things that are uncomfortable. So if it's an uncomfortable practice, even though it might be easy, there's probably a high chance that you won't keep doing it, which is what I found anyway in my own personal experience. So when I came across this technique that was easy, but also extremely beneficial, and I could quantify the impact it was having on my life, it became very easy to interact and include that in my day. The biggest thing is inclusion in your day, that integration of it into your day. We're in a world at the moment where the idea of closing our eyes and withdrawing our senses from pleasure is not something that many people would choose to do, because we have so much pleasure with our eyes open and our senses open. We got Uber Eats, we've got Netflix, we've got Spotify, we've got Netflix, we've got social media. So there's a lot of things to entertain us and pleasure us. So we have to make it really compelling to integrate that into our day, and finding a technique that I find gives us that sense of charm and bliss and enjoyment and pleasure, but also quantifiable effects that makes it measurable, then I think that's going to be the critical component. So for me personally, my recommendation always is to find a teacher that can teach you how to meditate, and meditate in a way that you get some benefits from that. Now just shop around, because I can't say which one is best for you. I would suggest you do your research, because there are some techniques that I find much more easier and more accessible and more impacting than others. And for that reason, I chose those techniques, and that's why I teach them. But I can't say definitively which one everyone should do, because we're just different humans. We're all different. And that's why we've got different choices on menus, because some people want the steak and some people want the chicken and some people want vegetarian. So shop around, do your research. And if it's not working for you, if you find that it's not the one for you, then keep looking. But definitely allowing some time, on a daily basis, for that quietness. And secondly, allowing a period of time ongoing for weeks or months to make that become sustainable, obvious interaction, then you'll start getting benefits. We want quick fixes these days. Mm-hmm. And a lot of us aren't really willing as much anymore to play the long game with things in our life. And if I go to the gym for one session, I'm not going to be fit. But if I go consistently every day, or 3 or 4 times a week, over a month, then I'll get fit. And we need to start thinking a little bit more about those longer term investments when it comes to our mental and physical health.
Is there an approximate time that you should be dedicating to meditating daily?
I find, if you think about a tree, before it started growing upwards, it went down first. And the reason it went down is for 2 reasons. It went down to get nutrients, and it went down to get stability. And I think starting your day each day with going inward, before you start scrolling, before you start looking at the news, before you start going to work and answering emails, I think getting that sense of deeper connectivity gives you a solid foundation. If you look at a tree in a storm without a deep root base, it falls over very easily. And I think this is what's happening with humans. We don't have a deep sense of self and connectivity to our inner being. And so we get toppled over very easily. You know, the in word at the moment is triggered. I get very triggered very easily. I'm very sensitive to feedback. And a lot of the times what we find there is a disconnect from the inner self, the inner being. And when we have that as a foundation, as a starting point for our day, and then go into activity, then we have greater capacity in that day to stand and withstand the storm and tempest that might arise. And secondly, I find as the day progresses, we get this sort of fading, particularly around 3, 4, 5 in the afternoon. You know, our days are fairly demanding these days with the amount of information we're processing. So I really find that afternoon session, usually around that sort of window of time between 5 and 7, when the day is changing from day to night, we're going from work to home, is a really nice transition time to slot in a nice afternoon meditation as well.
Yeah, I always educate patients when they first wake up. Of course, if meditation is part of their daily practice, amazing. But if not, don't use your phone for at least an hour and a half. You know, the first thing that a lot of people do is they scroll and they're consumed by emails and work. And that's probably one of the worst things you can do for your mind when you wake up. And news, if you can avoid it altogether, that'd be ideal, because nowadays it just kind of spews out negative information, and it just, it's not good to consume, right? I have one final thought just to kind of round up the discussion, and then you can perhaps make a comment on it or share some last minute thoughts of your own. It is from your Instagram again, and I think it just kind of sums up this conversation quite nicely and just resonates quite deeply. It says, imagine how enlightened we would be if we allocated the same amount of time we do drinking, shopping, smoking, social media, mainstream media, Netflix, to meditative practices. Imagine. Which makes me think of my favorite song, Imagine by John Lennon. I think it's just a beautiful, beautiful saying that you have on your social media. That's my final thought. Tom, if you have any last minute thoughts, I would love to hear them.
I produced a film called The Portal, and the film was really a medium to showcase the power of meditation against crisis in human experience. And we found 6 amazing stories, real life stories, where people were going through crisis, and they used the tool of meditation to help transform them out of that crisis by changing their inner state and then changing their outer state, rather than waiting for their outer state to change so that their inner state could change. That's the flip on the way most of the world is. And we also look at a global crisis as well, and why we're moving towards the edge of a cliff. And if we continue on this trajectory, we simply could walk off that cliff, and why we need a shift in consciousness on the planet. So it's a beautiful film that we're giving away to the world for free, and they can go to entertheportal.com to watch that film. But one of the great minds in that film was a man called Daniel Schmachtenberger, who was one of the futurists that we interviewed. And after we interviewed him, he's a very wise man, I think one of the brilliant minds on the planet right now. And he said, Tom, you have a big responsibility getting this film out to the world. And one thing I'd ask you to do is invite audiences that you interact with to start contemplating what life is like on an enlightened planet. Ask, what does that planet look like if everyone is enlightened? And what do I look like as an enlightened being on that planet? And he said, there's no one currently in charge of that direction for the planet. There's not a body or a government that's suddenly moving us towards enlightenment. It's something that is just going to happen as a response of billions of people individually finding that place. But if you can start to invite audiences to contemplate that, we start to gather a collective North Star of where we're going and what it looks like when we get there. And most of us rarely would think, what do I look like as an enlightened person? How would I act? How would I react? And what, if that got multiplied by billions, what would that look like for the planet? What would business look like if we're all enlightened in the businesses that we created, in the school system, the pharmaceutical system, the medical system, the banking system? And I'm extending that invitation to the audience today to start thinking, yeah, why aren't I enlightened? And what does it look like if I do spend a little bit more time subscribing to that idea and working towards that experience? And then what does that look like for me and the world that I create around me and the people around me as a result of me moving in that direction? And the ripple effect of that is quite phenomenal. you'll be blown away. It's been only 10 years since I left finance to what I'm doing today. And I look back and think, gosh, it hasn't been perfect, and I haven't been perfect by any means. And I still grapple with things, and I still get challenged by life, and I still make mistakes. But I'm definitely having a more positive effect on the world today than I did 20 years ago. And if I can multiply me and that effect by many, then we're going to have a very different planet over time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a beautiful concept, one that I am both hopeful and optimistic. Tom, this conversation it's been amazing. I've learned so much. I'm encouraged. I personally am gonna dive deep into meditative practice. I do meditate, but I want to kind of start going down perhaps a deeper form of it. I'm sure a lot of our viewers and audiences will be encouraged and hopefully intrigued to start, if not question, because it is for sure a powerful tool of healing, and it's indisputable. So Tom, thank you so much for taking the time and having this conversation today.
It's been a great joy. Thanks for inspiring the audience and myself with such great questions. I appreciate it.